So I found that really quite a moving documentary. And of course, movement is an operative word for this particular piece of work. I also was excited to see this video because of the ways in which it links us back to Galemba's paper about the illicit corn trade in Mexico. What we saw there was a study, of course, of people who were choosing to stay, choice being an interesting word to contemplate when we start to think about human agency. And in the sort of shadowy figures, or the figures that aren't really covered there, are the migrant laborers that are so significant to the Mexican economy, to the local economy, and of course to the domestic spheres in which they are also located, as we saw in the life of Wenceslas Contreras, or Winnie, as he was known, or as he is known. It's an interesting thing to contemplate, the whole way in which that movie shows us the deep connection that Winnie has with his family, and of course all of the kind of emotion associated with the waiting. I mean, it's a movie about movement, yes, but it's also a movie about waiting and anticipation. What I want to do here is something very unusual for me. I've never ever done this before. I almost feel like a mouthpiece of another scholar. I want to just share some of the insights of a particular paper. So let me go to that now. And the particular paper, Waldinger's Immigration and Election of Donald Trump, Why the Sociology of Migration Left Us Unprepared and Why We Should Not Have Been Surprised. Now, it occurs to me quite often that one of these central conceits or central premises of ethnographic research or case study research is the notion that the great is found in the small. And I think that that's an important notion for us to bear in mind here. Winnie's story reveals larger patterns. And the reason why I want to share some of the thoughts from this paper initially is because what Waldinger shows us are some of those patterns. So that Winnie's life is located in a broader picture, a broader structure and culture of human action, human activity. In this case, of course, it revolves around family life and long-term seasonal migration, a long time. So what we're talking about here is a form of labor migration, where the father of the household, and in the case of farming, it is often the male who's doing that work. But let's just remember that all across the world, we've got people from various parts, say the Philippines or Indonesia, working as maids in different parts of the globe, through Asia into the Middle East, and into Europe as well, but not so much as some of those other countries. So different types of work, and the amount of movement there is huge. And again, I think Waldinger picks up in some of his reflections out of the US some of those broader patterns as well. Let's get to them. Let's get to some of the ideas that he shares that are useful for us. He picks up on Massey's notion of cumulative causation, and what he's suggesting is that the migrant causes or engenders change in both the host and the home communities, and which shift and strengthen the motivations to leave home and to keep doing it. So the migrants use the gains to build extravagant houses, it's being described as there, and in the local context, often they are. I suppose we saw that really with Winnie, but it did seem like quite a comfortable existence that his family had, and would certainly have been compared with some of the people around them. The benefits to be had from living abroad and expanding their own holdings, and in agrarian areas, that often means land that's left untended. And that's also an interesting phenomenon of all of this, which in turn reduces the alternatives to those who prefer not to leave. They don't have access to that sort of land. And as we also picked up in the Galemba paper, it also is causing quite a few people to invest in some different ways in the place, such as the trucking industry, getting that corn over the borders into Guatemala. We also see in the host nation increasing densities of people. Now we get some sense of that out of the documentary because, of course, Winnie's immediate companions in the workspace there are people from his own village. Some of them are relatives of his as well, and this enables further enables a level of comfort with the going. Although we did, of course, hear the laments that were also part of probably daily life, or at least for the video they were. But probably, I think there's good reason to believe that there's always going to be a kind of a sadness at the heart of all of this as well. Waldinger makes the point about migrant motivation here. So the work, it can be difficult, dirty and dangerous, those 3 Ds. But nevertheless, the developed world jobs beckon, the global north beckons in various ways. And what we see in general here are children who are healthier, better educated, and who live longer. We couldn't see that last bit in the film, but we could certainly see the better educated part. That was the point of the film in lots of ways. They're just putting into practice, and this is, I think, a significant point that he makes, they're putting into practice what liberal societies would want them to do. Take care of, take responsibility for their own lives and of their families, and to do it without any help from anyone else. Of course, it does require some levels of help, but especially in the US setting, but it applies more generally. Don't expect welfare. Don't expect us, the people, to be looking after you. This is a transaction between you and your employer. Waldinger also discusses the amnesty that was a significant part of Winnie's story. It enabled him to stay and to keep going, keep returning to the farm in which he's been working for so many decades now. So what we get then is a situation of the legislation was put in place in 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, that enabled the likes of Winnie to stay, even though he'd only been there for a very short time by that stage, remembering that he first went there when he was 16. But as part of the deal around this, and these are always the kind of political compromises that go on in so many nation states when it comes to enabling some elements of migration, particularly from the third world, from the global south. I think there's a certain fear and prejudice that's at play there that we'll get to. I'm thinking about the Australian context. It's also present in the US, of course. But they prohibited the employment of undocumented immigrants, which was long championed by organised labour, the point I was just starting to make, and also sought by the nativists, those who would be identified as not Native American, that's another term here, but who would recognise themselves as American, as belonging to this place. This land is my land, kind of thing. And then worried about the Hispanicisation of the United States. So, of course, there's another code going on there in the nativists, in that there's nativists imagine the US as white in some way or other. And so the idea was to slap fines on the employers unwilling to comply with these new restrictions. But what's actually happened in practice is that became probably impossible to police in some ways, but also undesirable to do so because the economy is going gangbusters at various points in the 90s. And why would you want to get in the way of those kind of developments? And certainly the politicians aren't going to, when we think about where some of their major constituencies lie. So just returning to some of the general ideas of Waldinger's paper, and he is obviously focused on the ways in which, as you can pick up in the title, he's suggesting that sociology of immigration hasn't done a real good job, isn't real good at explaining the rise of Trump. But as he says, even had Trump lost the election, we would still want to know why. How we still want to explain his rise, his remarkable rise in political terms, by stoking immigration anxieties. Mudé and Kaltwasser described this as a democratic illiberal response, the Trumpian response, and his followers, to undemocratic liberalism. We'll explain a bit more about that as we go along. But what you've got is, of course, those who are advocates for the human rights of migrants, they are often drawing on the courts, unelected bodies, to look after these rights as being constituted in the Constitution and through international agreements and so on. So that's part of what they're getting at. Walding makes the point that in general migrants are seeking a better life. A point made, but of course there are other aspects to this. And as part and parcel of that, integration and assimilation become part of the expected normative outcome of migration and policy debate, or at least in the US it does. In Australia, I think there is some difference there that is borne out by the experience of the place. Our experiences are probably not all that different, but the ways in which policy gets formed in Australia, was formed in Australia, reflects the different polity, picking up a point I was making earlier in the introduction to this module. Sociological anthropological migration literature, he's suggesting here, his argument is fundamentally about them, the migrants. It's not about the us, the people within the boundaries. And he's suggesting that's one of the reasons why we haven't been able to deal and understand so well in the American context. The forces that are moving against the kind of liberal for the liberal desires and hopes within nation states, especially when it comes to the rights of migrants. So focusing on the leaving and settling patterns, the experience of migrants, paying little heed to those living in the host nations. He also gives a couple of a bit of applause to transnationalism and the ways in which the shift moved, the shift in migration thinking, theorization, sociology of this. And transnationalism, as he argues, straddles the gap between these literatures on emigration and immigration. So what happens, why do people go and what happens when they get there? The multiple ties and interactions linking people or institutions across the borders of nation states is what transnationalism is focused on, according to Waldinger. And he suggests very much that this is a historical phenomenon, that those connections between places of reception and origin are inherent, enduring components of long-distance migrations. So this is something that we will emphasize when thinking about Australian migration policy, is the recognition that that is a reality of the lives of people, no matter when they migrated. However, new technologies, especially in telecommunications, serve to connect such networks with increasing speed and efficiency. There's another notion that he picks up here is the notion of post-nationalism. So whereas once citizenship acquisition was once an essential component of integration or assimilation into a nation state, today's immigrants and descendants can continue on in many instances as denizens who enjoy the benefits of residence in the global north without having to actually join the people of the state where they live. Again, I think he's picking up reflections probably more out of the US and elsewhere, but in a place like Australia with its multicultural commitments, I think we can also see that as part of the reality, although of course many do become citizens. We're also at a time where dual citizenship is being allowed and perhaps even encouraged through the various agreements, international agreements that have been struck with individual nation states. So it's not simply about the arrival of strangers, but the appearance of aliens, a very American term when it comes to thinking about immigration, standing outside the circle of citizenship. They're not insiders in that sense. And we find that rights and entitlements are increasingly being determined by international treaties and conventions. So again, this undemocratic move that's going on, or at least that's how it can feel to many, many people within the nation state. So while Americans are sincere in expressing, this is another interesting point, expressing their preference for a bounded community, they also feel entitled to the freedoms of which recruiting the most malleable or cheapest or best and brightest labour force, regardless of national or ethnic background, has never been seen as an unimportant right. So what he's getting at is that there's contradictions that so often are part of national discussions about immigration. We want to be able to determine who comes here and under what conditions, to echo a certain former Prime Minister of Australia, and the conditions on which they come. Yes, we want to assert that right, and understandably, I mean, that's part of sovereignty of any nation state. But at the same time, we do also want to be able to we do need cheap labourers, and where are we going to get them from? And so you get these discussions in Australia about backpackers and seasonal workers that are coming out of Pacific Islands, especially. Something again that we'll pick up a little bit, probably more next week. So the politics of immigration bred policies that liberalised immigration, but were not terribly democratic, as they produced more expansion than voters wanted, or certain voters wanted. Let's keep remembering that. Let's remember that Trump didn't get a majority of the vote, but he got, of course, a very significant minority of the vote. Simultaneously, humanitarian advocates of immigration found another tool of our undemocratic leverage, as courts could be moved to advance liberalisation further. The typical conflict in immigration control is a restrictionist executive government pitted against independent courts defending the family or residence rights of immigrants on the basis of domestic law. Yeah, I think the US, we've seen that playing out quite a bit in recent times. And so then we get to the decision, Plyler and Doe, making primary and secondary education a constitutional right available to all persons, setting the stage for the Americanization of unauthorized migrants. So people, the children of the undocumented, who are of course themselves undocumented migrants. A development which has since taken the form of what's called the Dreamers. So let's just have a quick look at that, because now what I'm doing is setting up the next encounter you're going to get with a migrant, in this case, the daughter of a couple who chose to migrate. And the particular person is Carla Corneo Villavicencio. And she describes herself in this as being part of the Dreamers. She's one of the Dreamers who is looking for what's being discussed here. The Supreme Court blocking Donald Trump's bid to end the so-called DACA program, the DACA being the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, created by the Obama administration. So he's trying to block the Obama administration. It gets caught up in courts. And there's the reference to the Dreamers. Well, the Dreamers are those protected under DACA. And by the time that Trump announced his decision to rescind the program, many hundreds of thousands had already been granted approval. So they were given the chance to become acknowledged citizens. They had the right to education in this place and free, and not to have to worry about it in that way. So DACA was a compromise devised by the Obama administration after Congress failed to pass the Development, Relief and Education Act for alien minors, which would have offered the chance of permanent legal residency. And that legislation introduced in 2001 repeatedly failed to pass into law. So you can see it's a major split division in the US society, decisions around what to do with the undocumented. And you're going to hear then what are some of the consequences of living with that reality by one of the daughters of people who made this kind of a choice. That Waldinger picks up here, making border crossing more perilous, as has happened recently. As has happened recently in the US across that Mexican-US border. These same controls create the transnational families that the literature highlights, albeit in ways that yield neither incorporation in the home nor host society. This is no happy kind of settling into place. That's a kind of middle-class fantasy or middle-class practice, if you like, about being able to be transnational. It's not for those who are at the margins. It's a very different scene, as you're about to hear. Tighter border enforcement spurs prospective undocumented immigrants to leave children behind so as to spare them the risks of an unauthorized crossing. It's dangerous, and they could lose children. Who's going to want to do that? Once over the border, immigrant parents postpone return for fear of not being able to re-enter the United States. You're going to find this echoing into what you're just about to listen to. And so the result takes a form of deeper parental settlement in the United States and long-term familial disintegration across borders. An experience that creates additional integration difficulties if and when cross-border families are eventually reunited. The great is found in the small. You will, in hearing the story of an individual soon, you will see that it connects exactly, just about exactly, into this description of the broader experience of undocumented migrants and their families in the US. Also interesting is the ways in which we get a highlighting of the election of George Bush, 2000, where the tables appeared to turn again. 40% of the Latino vote represented the business wing. He gained 40% of the Latino vote, the business wing of the Immigrationist Coalition. But that option to be starting to grant rights into that group and to strengthen political capital there disappeared on 11th of September 2001 when the Twin Towers were attacked. Were torn down by aeroplanes, by stolen aeroplanes, hijacked aeroplanes. This is followed by a raft of new, mainly restrictive legislation and reorganization of the immigration bureaucracy. Again, you're about to hear about this in the smaller scale, the effects of that on an individual. And I think this is a grand way, I think, of capturing what happens in that tussle between the individual and society. And of course, where one is positioned in that society makes a big difference on one's life experiences, life outcomes, life chances in many cases. In the conclusion of the paper, in the very final paragraph, we see this reflection. There is no political community without boundaries. No people that can take responsibility for one another without some prior agreement as to the terms of belonging. That's impossible. Boundaries imply discrimination in favor of the citizens and against the aliens, though some exceptions can be made. I think we can see that resonance into Australia. Moreover, in a world where the population of would-be migrants exceeds the number that any state is willing to accept as potential citizens, happening everywhere, it seems to me, there are neither good choices to be had nor admissions criteria that are unambiguously more just than others. Consequently, conflict over the number, characteristics, and rights of immigrants is an inherent part of the phenomenon and one from which there is no escape. This is one of those wicked problems that perhaps people like yourself need to start trying to think about how you might take this on. But of course, we have to be aware of just how complex this is and be aware and be humble in what we can do in some ways, whilst also being ambitious enough to be able to achieve to match our own values to the outcomes that we should be seeking to be part of as citizens of this land. I'm going to leave it at that. The idea is for that to form a bridge between what you've just seen, what you're about to hear, to stimulate thought around it, to place it in that greater context, into that bigger structural context, to understand it that way. And this is one of those kind of moments of anthropological imaginary as well, you know, the anthropological perspective, where in doing a study elsewhere, taking it outside of the national boundary, we can start to see how our own place has some similarities, has some differences. We can start to understand our own place differently, I think. So Australia, obviously, in this case, so we can start to understand it differently and perhaps find ways of acting that show an awareness beyond the limits of our own boundaries. Good luck with it, and I'll see you in class.